1453 was a devastating time in the history of England. This is generally viewed as the year that marked the end of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had started back in 1337. In that year, King Edward III of England had tried to reclaim England's lost territories in northern and western France, and had then laid claim to the French throne. The conflict had seen England win major victories over the decades, notably at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, following which the goal of uniting the crowns of England and France was very nearly fulfilled. However, in the long term, the 100 Years' War was less successful for England. Between 1449 and 1453, England had lost virtually all of its remaining territories in France. Rouen, the capital of English Normandy, fell in 1449. Bordeaux was lost in 1451, and the English war effort was terminated at the Battle of Castillon on the 17th of July, 1453. Just weeks later, King Henry VI of England experienced a psychological collapse which left him virtually comatose for a year and a half, unable to engage with others in any way. Rebellions were breaking out around the country as the news of defeat in France and the collapse of royal authority spread. It was a period of distinct crisis. As all of this happened, many turned to one of England's leading nobles, believing that he was the man to lead the country away from the edge of the abyss. This man was Richard, the 3rd Duke of York. Richard was a great-grandson of King Edward III of England, who had started the 100 Years' War all the way back in 1337 and who had been seen as England's greatest monarch. A proven military commander and leader, Richard was seen by many as England's potential savior. Soon, the kingdom would be at war as Richard and his Yorkist faction attempted to claim control over the government from King Henry VI and the House of Lancaster, of which Henry was the head. The conflict which ensued, called the Wars of the Roses, would eventually see Richard's son become King of England, though it would be an all too brief rule for him and his successors. This is the story of the House of York. The House of York's rise began in the middle of the 14th century. However, in order to fully understand the dynasty, we need to look a little further back to the development of royal and state politics in England in the High Middle Ages. Back in the early Middle Ages, in the 8th and 9th centuries, England was divided into numerous different kingdoms. Among these were Mercia and Wessex, ruled broadly by Germanic Anglo-Saxons, and the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia, ruled by the Danes, who had arrived in large numbers in the 9th century. The Kingdom of Wessex gradually unified all of England in the late 9th and 10th centuries to the extent that a clear Kingdom of England had emerged by the 11th century, corresponding fairly closely to the modern-day nation of England. This all changed again in 1066, when a succession dispute led to William, Duke of Normandy in northern France, crossing to England and claiming power. The Norman conquest would have an enduring influence over the politics of England for centuries to come. It meant that the kings of England and its nobility also held land in the north of France. Additional lands in places like Maine, Aquitaine and Gascony in the west of France were acquired through dynastic marriages in the 12th century. As we have seen, developments concerning England's lands in France would form the background of the rise to power of the House of York centuries later. The rulers of England for centuries after the Norman conquest were all descended to one degree or another from William the Conqueror. From 1154, the royal dynasty became known as the House of Plantagenet. This was because King Henry II, who became King of England in 1154, was the son of Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou. One of Henry II's sons, King John, managed to lose a large proportion of the Plantagenet lands in France during his reign between 1199 and 1216, most notably the Duchy of Normandy. It would fall to John's successors to try and reclaim these lands. In particular, in 1337, John's great-great-grandson, King Edward III, launched a war with France to try and reclaim Normandy and other lands. 3 years later, he laid claim to the French throne, which back in 1328 had passed from the House of Capet to the House of Valois in France. This was the beginning of the 100 Years' War that would so shape the politics of England in the 14th and 15th centuries, defeat in which would pave the way for the House of York to claim the English throne. More broadly, Edward III reigned for 50 years between 1327 and 1377. Of the 13 children he and his wife Philippa of Hainault had, 8 were boys, and 5 of these lived into adulthood. The eldest of these was Edward, born in 1330 and commonly known as the Black Prince. Lionel, Duke of Clarence, was the second eldest and was born in 1338. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, followed in 1340, followed by Edmund of Langley, first Duke of York, in 1341, and finally Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, in 1355. The House of York would be descended from the fourth of these 5 sons, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York. Edmund of Langley, the founder of the House of York, was born on the 5th of June 1341. His name derives from his having been born at King's Langley in Hertfordshire, just north of the City of London. Each of Edward's 5 adult sons ended up receiving large estates around England, often as older noble lines died out. Early in his life, when his godfather John de Warenne, 7th Earl of Surrey, died in 1347, Edmund was granted a large chunk of Surrey's lands, as the Earl had died without any son to inherit his estate. Many of these lands were located in Yorkshire in the north of England, creating a link between Edmund, York, and the Yorkshire region. The period between the outbreak of the 100 Years' War in 1337 and the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 was an intense part of the war. It was also one in which England won many great victories. For a time, it seemed like Edward III would reclaim all of the lands which had been lost by King John a century and a half earlier. Given the intensity of the conflict, Edmund was campaigning in France by the late 1350s, while he was still little more than a teenager by modern terms. He took part in several further expeditions in the 1360s and 1370s, although by then the war had turned into more of a stalemate. Edmund's role was small in the conflict at this stage, as the primary English military leaders were his older brothers, Edward, the Black Prince, and John of Gaunt. Edmund's father died in 1377, at which time the throne passed to Richard, a son of the Black Prince. Edward had predeceased his father by a year, dying of a prolonged case of dysentery in 1376. Richard was a child at the time of his accession, and his uncles played a large role in running the kingdom during his minority. It was during this period, in 1385, that Edmund, who had been Earl of Cambridge since 1362, was made Duke of York. This appointment formed the basis for Edmund and his descendants to be known as members of the House of York. It is worth pausing here to consider the significance of this title and the lands involved. Today, the city of York in northern England is a modest provincial city. Depending on whether the incorporated city itself is being considered or the wider metropolitan area, the population of the city is between around 140,000 and 200,000 people. This means it barely fits into the top 30 largest cities in modern England, placing it in a similar category with small cities like Swindon and Blackpool. However, York was once a city of great significance within England. It was the northern capital of the Roman presence in Britain, when it was known as Eboracum, and lay just south of Hadrian's Wall. Because it had been a major centre of civic life and settlement in Roman times, it remained one of the leading urban centres in Britain in the early medieval era. Moreover, as the early Roman Catholic Church tended to be arranged along the administrative lines used by the Roman Empire, York was created as an archdiocese and was one of the main centres of Christian worship in England from very early on in the history of Christianity in Britain. A cathedral in one form or another has existed in York since the 7th century. There was even a dispute running for centuries over whether the Archdiocese of Canterbury or York had primacy within the church administration in England. When Edmund of Langley was created as Duke of York, the city was the second largest in England, eclipsed only by London. Thus, in being made Duke of York, Edmund was being given a great title over a city that was effectively the capital of the North. Edmund continued to play a role in the affairs of the realm even as his nephew, King Richard II, reached his majority and began ruling in his own right. Richard had started to rule when he reached his 14th year in 1381, and gradually assumed the full responsibilities of the kingship during the 1380s. However, Richard was not a popular ruler. He alienated large parts of the aristocracy and faced a major crisis between 1386 and 1388. The opposition to Richard at this time was led by the Lords Appellant, a cohort of senior nobles which included Henry Bolingbroke, the son and heir of John of Gaunt, and another of Edmund's nephews. After being brought to heel by his own nobles and made to remove several highly unpopular government ministers, Richard ruled in a more demure manner for several years, although during the 1390s he once again came into conflict with large parts of the political community and aristocracy. Edmund steered a more moderate course and maintained a decent relationship with his nephew. Hence, when Richard undertook his first expedition to Ireland to try to increase English control over the island in 1394, Edmund was placed in charge of the government in England during the king's absence. Edmund ultimately lived down to August 1402. This means that he lived to see a second major bout of opposition to Richard's rule at the end of the 1390s. This led to Henry Bolingbroke, whose father John of Gaunt had died just months earlier, returning from exile on the continent and claiming the throne in 1399. Richard was deposed and was seemingly starved to death in captivity early in 1400. The accession of Henry as King Henry IV brought the House of Lancaster to power, so named because John of Gaunt, Henry's father, had been the Duke of Lancaster. Edmund was succeeded as Duke of York when he died in 1402 by his son Edward, the eldest of 3 children that Edmund had with his first wife, Isabella of Castile. Edward is understood to have been born in 1373. He is sometimes styled Edward of Norwich, even though there is no concrete evidence to suggest he was born there. Instead, he was probably born at Langley just like his father. He was too young to play much of a role in the initial opposition to his royal cousin Richard II in the late 1380s. By the 1390s, however, Edward was directly involved in political developments and played a more significant role in court affairs as his father tried to act as a mediator between opposing factions. A sign of his good relationship with Richard is seen in Edward's appointment as the Earl of Rutland in 1390, and, 2 years later, his appointment to the Royal Council. Edward accompanied Richard to Ireland on campaign in 1394, and again for a second time in 1399. In these later years, Edward was given large grants of lands which Richard confiscated from other nobles. He was evidently someone who was close to the king. Therefore, when Henry IV claimed the throne, Edward was deprived of his offices and had to spend several years trying to rehabilitate himself within the new Lancastrian royal regime. Edward's succession as second Duke of York in 1402 provided a brief respite, but later he was arrested for allegedly playing a role in the outbreak of a major rebellion in Wales. Ultimately, Edward's position improved as Henry IV's health declined from the mid-1400s onwards, and his son and heir, the future King Henry V, began to assume greater control over royal affairs. In 1415, 2 years after Henry IV's premature death, possibly from leprosy, Henry V launched a new phase of the 100 Years' War by invading northern France. Edward was present when the second Lancastrian king won a great victory over the French at the Battle of Agincourt on the 25th of October 1415. Unfortunately, though, Edward was the most high-profile casualty on the English side. He suffered a dramatic death when he was seemingly struck in the head during the course of the battle. Though Edward had technically been married twice, his first marriage was annulled, and the second did not result in any children. Therefore, the title of Duke of York and the extensive Yorkist estates in the north of England and elsewhere passed to his nephew, Richard of York. Richard was the son of Richard of Conisbrough, the third Earl of Cambridge and the youngest son of the first Duke of York. The Earl of Cambridge had been implicated in the Southampton plot, a conspiracy against King Henry V, and had been executed for his role in it back in early August 1415, less than 3 months before the second Duke of York died. Therefore, when the second Duke died, the title passed to Richard of York when he was just turning 4 years old. It was a peculiar situation. A 4-year-old whose father had just been executed for treason was suddenly elevated to become one of the most senior nobles of the realm. Richard would be the most consequential figure in the brief rise to power of the House of York. Because he was a child and would remain so for many years to come, Richard became a royal ward in 1415, meaning that his estates were managed by the crown and his education and upbringing was monitored by the king. He was handed over to the household of the prominent Lancastrian Robert Waterton. Later, he was made a ward of the Neville family, the Earls of Westmoreland, one of the great aristocratic lineages located on the border region with Scotland. Richard of York was not the only descendant of Edward III to experience a strange childhood. On the 31st of August 1422, King Henry V had died fairly suddenly in France while on campaign there, possibly from dysentery or smallpox. It was unfortunate timing. The major victory won by Henry over the French at Agincourt had turned the war hugely in England's favour. In 1420, Henry had successfully coerced the French into agreeing to the Treaty of Troyes, whereby Henry, as King of England, would succeed King Charles VI of France when he died. Henry's death was therefore problematic, in that he was succeeded by his infant son, King Henry VI, who was not even a year old at the time. As a young child, Henry VI would have had huge limitations in understanding the complex political problems faced by his kingdom in the late Middle Ages. Nevertheless, he would consequently spend his childhood attending Regency government council meetings where war and peace, revolts and taxation were discussed regardless. By the time Henry came of age, ruling in his own right from 1437, Richard, Duke of York, was now in his mid-20s and had started to play a leading role in the war against the French. The French had, by the 1420s, understandably reneged on the terms of the Treaty of Troy and had now regained the momentum in the war against the English. Into the 1440s, Richard, Duke of York, established himself as the direct opposite of his royal cousin Henry. The third Lancastrian monarch was an adult by then, but he was not an effective ruler and was dominated by his Beaufort cousins. These were the descendants of John of Gaunt via his affair with a woman named Catherine Swynford, though the children had been retroactively legitimized and John eventually married Swynford in his later years. Equally, the king seemed to take his cues from his wife, the French princess Margaret of Anjou, who married Henry in 1445, just after her 15th birthday, and who grew into a formidable queen, her tenacity contrasting sharply with her husband's weakness. As all of this occurred, Richard, 3rd Duke of York, became a point of concern at the Lancastrian court. As a royal cousin, close to the throne, the popular duke was perceived as a threat, especially by the Beauforts, who believed that their position could be undermined if York was promoted further. In particular, there was a growing rivalry between York and Edmund Beaufort, 2nd Duke of Somerset. The Beauforts were rich in titles by the middle of the 15th century, but poor in estates and wealth. Their peculiar backstory, as children born out of wedlock and then retroactively legitimized when Gaunt finally married their mother, meant that their Lancastrian estates were primarily in the possession of the crown. The Beauforts therefore sought to dominate the weak-willed Henry VI as the best means of acquiring greater power and influence. Richard of York was an impediment to this, and so from the mid-1440s, Somerset was actively conspiring to have York removed from positions of authority in France. Instead, Richard was appointed as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Ireland had been partially conquered by the English crown in the late 12th and 13th centuries, only for an Irish resurgence to push the English back towards a pale around Dublin in the 14th and 15th centuries. York was appointed to take up his position in Ireland in 1447, though in the end he only went there in 1449, and his term as governor was short. Richard returned to England after a major rebellion broke out in the summer of 1450, led by a commoner called Jack Cade. The scale of this revolt indicated how unpopular Henry VI's rule had become, following the loss of Rouen in Normandy the previous year. From this point on, there were growing tensions between York and the Lancastrians. The escalating rivalry between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians came to a head, as we have seen in 1453. In that year, the English war effort fully collapsed in France, and was followed weeks later by King Henry's psychological breakdown. Henry would not recover on any level for nearly a year and a half. It was Christmas 1454 before he started to vaguely interact again with others around him. In the interim, the Queen had given birth to a son and heir. This was Edward of Westminster, born in October 1453. Margaret, Edward's mother, was determined to prop up the House of Lancaster for as many years as needed to ensure her son rose to the throne in the future, no matter how disastrous her husband's rule was proving to be. However, a substantial number of senior nobles, local office holders, and prominent ecclesiastics viewed the situation very differently. They believed that York was now the man to save England from its recent woes. In March 1454, in the face of opposition from both the Queen and the Beauforts, Richard was therefore appointed as Lord Protector of the realm so long as the king was incapacitated. York was able to use his position to promote several of his closest allies to senior positions. For instance, he made his brother-in-law Richard Neville, 5th Earl of Salisbury, Lord Chancellor of England, in the process winning over the Neville family's loyalty in the north of England. The Lancastrians were scheming too. Matters came to a head when Henry began to partially recover at the end of 1454. Although he would never be himself again, and suffered periodic breakdowns in the years that followed, the king's conditions seemed to have improved enough that the Queen, the Beauforts and other Lancastrians were now able to claim that York was no longer needed as Lord Protector. By then, though, the battle lines had already been drawn. As the Lancastrians moved to reduce York's influence, war broke out. Historians are divided as to when this conflict, named the Wars of the Roses, actually began. Some argue that it started back in the reign of Richard II, who was overthrown by Henry IV and the House of Lancaster. What's much clearer is that the really intense period of the wars began in 1455. It was then that the Yorkists and the Lancastrians went to war over the issue of the unsatisfactory kingship of Henry VI. The initial stage of the war was actually resolved fairly quickly in a single decisive battle. On the 22nd of May 1455, two Yorkist and Lancastrian armies, numbering no more than a few thousand men on each side, clashed in and around the town of St Albans, north of London. Here, Richard and the supporters of the House of York won a crushing victory. They not only defeated the Lancastrian force and captured the semi-cognizant king, they also surrounded the leading Lancastrian nobles in the Castle Inn in the town and killed York's nemesis, Edmund Beaufort, 2nd Duke of Somerset, as he tried to fight his way out. With the head of the Beaufort faction dead and the king his prisoner, York marched south to London and took over the government again. Richard was reappointed as the Lord Protector of the realm by Parliament when it convened late in 1455, and was the de facto ruler of England in the years that followed, even as Henry VI nominally remained the king. But there were graver issues at work. The rise of the House of York was a symptom of a wider problem in 15th century England, the breakdown of royal authority and the squabbles between overmighty nobles like the Nevilles and the Percys in the north of England. Over the next few years as Lord Protector, Richard of York tried and failed to stop these noble rivalries. Furthermore, the Beaufort case was resurrected by Henry Beaufort, 3rd Duke of Somerset, who allied with the Queen. As a result, in 1459, civil war erupted once more. During this latest phase of the Wars of the Roses, the Duke of York was increasingly of the view that King Henry VI would have to be deposed altogether. Richard would also have to press his right to rule in lieu of an incapable monarch, much as Henry Bolingbroke had seized the throne from his cousin Richard II back in 1399. Richard had a strong claim to the throne. As we have seen, he was the grandson of Edmund of Langley, 1st Duke of York, the 4th adult son of King Edward III. Thus he was the great-grandson of Edward III on his father's side. But beyond this, Richard also had an even stronger claim to the crown on his mother's side. She was Anne Mortimer, a descendant of Lionel, Duke of Clarence, the second eldest child of Edward III. As the male line of the Black Prince, Edward III's eldest son, had died out when Richard II was killed in 1400, the line of the Duke of Clarence would have had the strongest claim to the throne thereafter. However, the Lancastrians, descended from John of Gaunt, the third eldest son, had seized the throne in 1399. In any event, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, only had a single daughter. It was this female line from which Richard of York was descended from on his mother's side. Hence, in the autumn of 1460, Richard began to press his claim to the throne, worn out from years of conflict over who should manage the realm, given Henry VI's inability to do so himself. This argument rested on the fact that his line of descent, from both the second and fourth sons of Edward III, made his claim to the throne stronger and more legitimate than that of Henry VI. Many agreed with him, but unfortunately York would never be able to claim that which he was now arguing was his birthright. Just 3 months later, on the 30th of December 1460, he was killed fighting at the Battle of Wakefield in northern England. Richard's death, however, was not the travesty for the House of York which many viewed it as being at the time. It was quickly revealed that his son and heir, Edward, 4th Duke of York, was an immensely capable young man who took over the leadership of the Yorkist cause smoothly and effectively. Although he was only 18 years old at the time of his father's death, Edward was already a seasoned military commander who had fought alongside his father since the reigniting of the war in 1459. Unusually tall for the time, at 6 foot 4 inches, handsome and affable, Edward cut an imposing figure who stood in stark contrast to Henry VI. Following his father's death, he rallied the Yorkists and won 2 major victories over the Lancastrians at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in February 1461, and then at the Battle of Towton. The latter clash in North Yorkshire on the 29th of March 1461 was the defining battle of this stage of the Wars of the Roses. Tens of thousands of men fought at Towton, making it a battle of unprecedented size in the clash between the houses of York and Lancaster and their respective allies. Although substantially outnumbered, Edward's archers took advantage of a wind that was blowing in their favour, sowing havoc in the Lancastrian lines from afar. They then engaged at close range and routed the Lancastrians. The core of the Lancastrian faction fled over the border to Scotland, while Edward proceeded south and was crowned at Westminster Abbey outside London as King Edward IV on the 28th of June 1461. The difference between Edward IV and Henry VI as King of England could not have been greater. The new king was energetic and a man of purpose, and yet he faced many of the same problems that his father had to contend with when he had served as Lord Protector of the realm between 1455 and 1459. There were too many fractious lords and overmighty aristocrats. In particular, his cousin Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, an immensely wealthy and powerful aristocrat, was a problem. Neville's influence in the Wars of the Roses was so great that he is remembered as Warwick the Kingmaker. Such was his ability to swing the conflict to one side or the other. Additionally, Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, was clambering for greater power in the new administration. Finally, the Lancastrians were still at large. Their cause had been dealt a serious blow via defeat at the Battle of Hexham on the 15th of May 1464, and with Henry VI's capture and imprisonment in the Tower of London not long afterwards. Nevertheless, Margaret of Anjou, the former queen, remained an active presence in English politics, with her and Henry's son, Edward of Westminster. In 1470, she cobbled together an alliance of continental allies and English allies like Warwick, who turned on King Edward and allied with the Lancastrians. Edward was briefly overthrown, and the befuddled Henry was taken from the Tower of London and restored to the throne. The re-adeption of Henry VI, as it is known, was short-lived though. Edward travelled to the Low Countries, gathered his own allies and mercenaries, and returned to England. There he defeated the Lancastrians once and for all at the Battle of Barnet on Easter Sunday 1471. Warwick was killed that day. 3 weeks later, Edward of Westminster, Henry VI's young son and heir, was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Once his more competent son was dead, there was little reason to keep Henry alive. On the night of the 21st of May 1471, Henry was murdered in the Tower of London. Edward reassumed the throne, all of his enemies seemingly vanquished. The second reign of Edward IV, from 1471 to 1483, was the high point of the House of York. The direct line of the House of Lancaster, descended from John of Gaunt, was at an end with the killing of both Henry VI and his son. The Beauforts had also seemingly been vanquished, and Warwick the Kingmaker and others had lost their lives in the most recent bout of fighting. The over-mighty conduct of the nobles had been tamed. Edward was consequently able to begin his rule like a normal monarch to a certain extent. There were minor revolts, notably by John de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, an unreformed Lancastrian, but for the most part Edward had control over the kingdom. This was most evident in his foreign policy. With things stable for once on the home front, Edward was able to try to revive the war with France, for the first time since 1453. England had retained control of a single enclave on the continent, the port of Calais and its hinterland. Edward imagined he could try to reclaim Normandy one day, using the port of Calais to his advantage. In 1474, he formed a new alliance with the Duchy of Burgundy through the Treaty of London, and the following year he invaded France with over 10,000 men. The campaign came to nothing though. King Louis XI of France quickly bribed Edward with a large cash payment to abandon the effort, and the Treaty of Picquigny of August 1475 essentially confirmed that the 100 Years' War had ended in 1453. Edward then turned to try to revive and expand the English lordship in Ireland, and also began meddling in Scotland's affairs to increase English influence north of the border. Essentially, it was back to business as usual. The civil wars appeared to be over. The premature death of numerous English monarchs has had a significant bearing on England's history. Had Mary Tudor not died at 42 years of age after a short 5-year reign in 1558, perhaps she would have managed to fully restore Roman Catholicism in her country. Similarly, the Wars of the Roses might have been over in 1471, and the House of York might have ruled for centuries to come had it not been for Edward IV dying on the 9th of April 1483, a few weeks shy of his 41st birthday. Edward's premature death, from causes which remain unclear, was not a disaster for the House of York. He and his wife, Elizabeth Woodville, had 10 children between 1466 and 1480, 7 of whom had survived infancy and were still alive when he died in 1483. Of these, 2 were boys, Edward, born in 1470, and Richard, born in 1473. The older now became King Edward V. Ideally, his father would have lived longer to ensure that his heir was a full adult when he succeeded to the throne, preferably having married and produced his own male heirs. But Edward V was 12 and a half on becoming king, and would be able to start ruling in his own right within a few years. The House of York's hold on the throne looked like it would survive Edward IV's premature death. Then, the unthinkable happened. The deceased king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been appointed as Lord Protector of the realm during his nephew's minority. In the months that followed, he usurped the throne and had both of Edward's sons, King Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, otherwise known as Richard of Shrewsbury, placed in the Tower of London. On the 26th of June 1483, he was proclaimed as King Richard III and was crowned a week and a half later. As we will see, it is assumed that he had his two young nephews killed in the Tower not long afterwards. Richard's appalling actions resurrected the Wars of the Roses. Indeed, there had been a threat to the House of York developing for some time in France, long before Edward IV had died and Richard had moved to usurp the throne. This came from Henry Tudor, a scion of a Welsh noble family. Henry's father was Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, while his mother was Margaret Beaufort. As her surname suggests, she was descended from John of Gaunt through his extended affair and belated marriage to Catherine Swynford. Therefore, despite his Welsh background, Henry had a tenuous claim to the throne through the Lancastrian line. He was a great-great-grandson of John of Gaunt and a great-great-great-grandson of King Edward III. Henry's claim to the throne was weak. The Beauforts had been legitimized back at the end of the 14th century, but that had come with a clause that they could not inherit the throne. The Lancastrian claim held good only for those descendants of John of Gaunt who had been born in wedlock. The Beauforts did not qualify. Nevertheless, the fear that Henry Tudor might one day press a claim to the throne was sufficient enough to concern the ruling family. When Edward IV won the brief civil war at the start of the 1470s and reasserted himself as king, Henry Tudor, who was 14 years old at the time, had been bundled off to France and had lived in exile in Brittany. Now, in 1483, with Richard having usurped the throne from his nephew and with elements of the French, Breton and Scottish courts all willing to support his claim, Henry Tudor, backed by his formidable mother Margaret Beaufort, made a bid for the throne. It was the final stage of the Wars of the Roses and would bring about the end of the House of York. As with several other phases of the Wars of the Roses in 1455 and the reademption of Henry VI in late 1470 and early 1471, the struggle between Richard III and Henry Tudor was a brief one. Henry and several thousand supporters sailed from the port of Harfleur on the 1st of August 1485. They landed in Wales, where it was expected that the local population would flock to support the Tudor cause. This was a complicated thing to do, however, as the Tudors were also trying to downplay their Welsh heritage to cement their claim to the throne based on their Englishness. Richard had been preparing for weeks for the invasion and marched northwest from London to meet the threat to his rule. Meanwhile, Henry and his followers headed north through Wales and then turned east to capture Shrewsbury, the key border town between Wales and the English West Midlands. Then they continued on. The war came to a head in one key battle outside the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire on the 22nd of August 1485. The Battle of Bosworth Field involved roughly 20,000 men in all. However, accounts of it from the 15th and 16th centuries suggest that the outcome of the battle was basically determined by the fact that Richard III attempted a charge directly at Henry Tudor and was killed in the ensuing melee. The Yorkist forces melted away as they learned that their leader was dead. In the aftermath of the battle, Henry Tudor was proclaimed as King Henry VII of England. The House of York was at an end, after less than a quarter of a century on the throne. Victory at Bosworth Field ushered in a new royal house to rule England. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne might have been based on his descent from the House of Lancaster, but since this was on his mother's side, a new royal house was established, the House of Tudor. There were several loose ends. Richard III had only had one legitimate son, Edward of Middleham. He had died in 1484 from a sudden and unknown cause. Richard did have an older, illegitimate son, John of Gloucester, who was about 17 years old at the time of Bosworth Field. Because he was illegitimate, it was assumed that he did not pose a threat to the Tudors. Still, in 1499, after numerous rebellions by Yorkist pretenders, Henry VII appears to have reconsidered. The admittedly scant details suggest that Henry had John murdered that year. Beyond this, Henry decided on a very wise political move following Bosworth Field. His claim to the throne came via the Lancastrian line. He would now unite this to the Yorkist claim. Thus, in January 1486, he married Elizabeth of York, the oldest daughter of King Edward IV. The goal was that the children of this marriage would then have a claim to the throne via both the House of Lancaster on Henry's side and via the House of York on their mother's side. Hence, Henry VIII, who would come to the throne in 1509 as the second Tudor monarch, was descended from both the houses of Lancaster and York. In a roundabout way, this means that the House of York lived on, albeit through the maternal line, via the Tudor dynasty. Every ruler of England and Britain since 1509 has consequently had a link, however weak, to the House of York. Henry VII appeared to have finally brought the Wars of the Roses to an end. There were loose ends at the same time. Many wondered what had happened to the two sons of King Edward IV, his heir and successor, King Edward V, and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, who had held the title of Duke of York. The pair had been placed in the Tower of London by their uncle, and as a result are generally referred to today as the Princes in the Tower. There was no information about what had happened to them after Richard III placed them in the fortress on the eastern edge of London. If they were alive, they surely had a claim to the throne, especially so because Edward V had, according to royal law, succeeded his father as king immediately upon Edward IV's death. This issue, though, would never have to be dealt with. There is no definitive evidence to prove it, and no record has ever been found to indicate what Richard did to his nephews. Nevertheless, almost all historians agree that the two boys were dead before Henry Tudor clashed with the last king of the House of York at Bosworth Field in 1485. Richard must have ordered them to be discreetly killed after he had them imprisoned in the Tower. He likely feared that the princes could become a source of opposition to his rule as they grew up. In the summer of 1674, a makeshift coffin, more like a wooden crate, was found in the tower with two small sets of skeletal remains within it. These were placed in the royal crypt in Westminster Abbey under the belief that they were the remains of the princes in the Tower. This has never been proved beyond doubt. The uncertainty about what had happened to the princes in the Tower had ramifications for the reign of Henry VII. In 1487, a child whose real name was Lambert Simnel was proclaimed initially as one of the princes in the Tower, though his handlers later changed his identity to suggest he was George Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick, and a nephew of the deceased King Edward IV. He was taken to Ireland, the old Yorkist stronghold since the third Duke's time there, in 1449 and 1450, where he was proclaimed as King Edward VI in opposition to Henry VII. This effort to revive the House of York ended in military defeat at the Battle of Stoke Field on the 16th of June 1487. 3 years later, a new pretender by the name of Perkin Warbeck appeared and also made his way to Ireland. There he claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower. Warbeck posed a graver threat to Henry VII and was at large for most of the 1490s, during which time he raised several armies. He was finally captured late in 1497 and executed in 1499. Hence, While neither Simnel or Warbeck were genuine in their claims, their cases emphasize how the unanswered questions about the fate of the princes in the Tower led to efforts to revive the House of York during the early period of Tudor rule. For decades thereafter, the Geraldine faction in Ireland, which had supported the Yorkists greatly in the 15th century, would be perceived as a centre of Yorkist support, which continued long after the Tudors came to power. As late as the 1520s and 1530s, officials were writing about the dangers of unreformed Yorkist supporters emerging there decades after it had become clear that the princes in the Tower would never be seen again. There was another branch of the House of York that posed a threat to the Tudors well into the 16th century. This came from the de la Pole family. The third Duke of York had 7 children. 2 of them, Edward IV and Richard III, had become kings of England. As we have seen, George, Duke of Clarence, had rebelled against his brother, a move for which he was executed in 1478. A 4th boy, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, had lost his life at the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December 1460, the same clash in which his father was killed. That left 3 daughters, Anne, Elizabeth and Margaret. 2 of these had children who lived into the 16th century. Anne's daughter, Anne St. Leger, died in 1526 after having many children. While her descendants were never considered a threat to the Tudors, the same could not be said of the descendants of Elizabeth of York. She married John de la Pole, the 2nd Duke of Suffolk, one of the leading aristocrats of the realm. Their son, Edmund, 3rd Duke of Suffolk, was a nephew of both Edward IV and Richard III, and arguably had a stronger claim to the English throne than Henry VII and his successor, Henry VIII, did. This left the first 2 Tudor monarchs on edge. The de la Poles did little to relieve their concerns, conspiring with foreign governments in such a way to make it appear as though they planned to revive the Wars of the Roses. Several of the de la Poles were eventually placed in the Tower, and many of them were executed in the early 16th century, including the 3rd Duke in 1513. Separately, George, Duke of Clarence's descendants were part of the Pole family via his daughter Margaret's marriage to Sir Richard Pole. Their offspring included Reginald Pole, a cardinal of the Church and later the Archbishop of Canterbury. He opposed the introduction of the Protestant Reformation in England by Henry VIII, while living on the continent from the mid-1530s onwards. Significantly, there were constant concerns in the last decade of Henry VIII's reign that the Pole family would attempt to lay claim to the throne through the female stem of the House of York. As late as 1603, when the last of the Tudors, Queen Elizabeth I, died without an heir, there was speculation that the Hastings family, Earls of Huntingdon, had a claim to the throne based on a circuitous descent from the House of York. Hence, while the House of York had only briefly held the throne between 1461 and 1485, the Yorkist claims to it continued for over a century and cast an air of insecurity over the entirety of the reign of the Tudors. While the House of York had been destroyed at the end of the Wars of the Roses and was viewed as a direct threat to the Tudors over the next century, the lands they had owned and the dukedom continued to occupy a prominent place in the aristocratic politics of England. In 1494, as he sought to shore up his family's control over England, Henry VII named his 2nd son, the future King Henry VIII, as the new Duke of York. Henry was the spare heir, and it was intended that he would hold the title of Duke of York as the preeminent noble of the realm, after his older brother Arthur became king one day. However, Prince Arthur died in 1502, and Henry became king upon their father's death in 1509. At this time, the title of Duke of York was again suppressed, and the duchy's lands were incorporated into the royal estate once more. History repeated itself a century later, when King James I made his second eldest son, Charles, Duke of York in 1605, in a mirror image of developments with Henry and Arthur a century earlier. Charles's older brother, the heir apparent, Prince Henry Frederick, died in 1612. This resulted in Charles succeeding as King Charles I in 1625, and the dukedom was suppressed yet again. Charles in turn bestowed the title on his second eldest son, James, in 1634, cementing the notion that the second eldest son of the king should hold the title of Duke of York, while the eldest son and heir was the Prince of Wales. In James's case, this has had a lasting impact on the world. After an English force seized the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island in 1664, triggering the Second Anglo-Dutch War in the process, his brother, King Charles II, bestowed the lands on James, who still held the title of Duke of York at that time. Hence, New Amsterdam was renamed as New York. The House of York was long gone from power, but 2 centuries later, the York title was responsible for how the financial capital of the world acquired its name. There have been several further creations of the title of Duke of York in the centuries since, always for the second eldest son of the ruling king or queen. Strangely, in all 5 instances, Henry VIII, Charles I, James II, George V, and George VI, each of these Dukes of York ended up becoming king, either because of the death of their older brother or a royal abdication. Thus, the title has never been passed on. It is constantly reabsorbed into the royal estate as the Duke of York becomes king. This pattern does look set to be broken, though, by the current holder of the title, Andrew, Duke of York, a disgraced figure who is far down in the line of succession. As he has no male heirs, the title will die out with him once again, and might possibly be conferred on Prince William's younger son, Louis, in years to come. The House of York are a strange royal house within English political history. If one treats the houses of Lancaster and York as separate entities from the wider Plantagenet dynasty, then the House of York has the dubious distinction of being the most short-lived royal line in English and British history. Its heads ruled for a grand total of around 23 years and were overthrown twice in the space of a quarter of a century. It is a peculiar scenario when we consider that the Yorkists came to power chiefly because the third Duke of York was perceived as a potential saviour of England during a period of immense crisis. The roots of the Yorkists, like their Lancastrian rivals, are found in the children of King Edward III. The family was descended from Edmund of Langley, 1st Duke of York, though the family's more senior claim to the throne descended from Lionel, Duke of Clarence. The first and second dukes were ultimately individuals who demonstrated a pragmatic approach to power during a period of sustained crisis in England's political history. Neither opposed Richard II, and both reconciled themselves fairly quickly to the new dispensation once the Lancastrians seized the throne in 1399. What shifted matters were the events of the middle of the 15th century, when the third Duke of York emerged as a figure who was clearly more competent than his royal cousin, King Henry VI. First, he became Lord Protector of the realm. Then he moved to claim the crown himself. Though his premature death ensured that he never became king, within 3 months of his death, his young son and heir had taken up his cause and had deposed Henry VI to become the first ruler of the House of York in 1461. Edward IV was a competent king, but so disordered was England's politics by that time that he was briefly removed from power in 1470, only to claim the throne back a half a year later. Ultimately, what brought the House of York down was Edward's premature passing and the heinous decision of his brother Richard to have his nephews murdered, usurping the throne himself. The fact that Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was extremely weak was compensated for by the fact that he was avenging a terrible crime on Richard's part. With that, the House of York formally came to an end in 1485, even though Yorkist claims to the throne persisted for far longer than did those on behalf of the House of Lancaster. What do you think of the House of York? Were the third Duke of York and his son justified in trying to claim the throne of England from their Lancastrian cousin, given Henry VI's apparent inability to rule? Or should they have followed the chain of succession and allowed Edward of Westminster to succeed his father in due course? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.